All right. So, as Serena said, my name is John Jacob. I'm a retired professor and extension specialist emeritus at Texas A&M University in Texas, of course. And we just retired about a little over 2 years now, and we spend our time between Guatemala in Central America and Texas. I grew up here in Guatemala. And a lot of the kind of stuff that I'm going to be talking about springs from my experience as a young, kind of as an informal extension agent. My father was helping smallholder campesinos all throughout the highlands, and I was kind of a promoter. I would run around to these different towns and help people get set up to do strawberries. So I had this deep feeling already, kind of love for the environment, say when I'm 16, 17. And, we like to chat at that age, because this is, those of us with a little more gray hairs, that's when we came along, right? During the time of, kind of this environmental awakening. And so that's where I came from. And I viewed everything pretty much like that the forests and the prairies is all good, and cities are wicked and bad places, and it's all contaminated. It's just horrible. So that's how I came through to this. So just a little bit on the professional background. I'm a professional wetland scientist, do a lot of work in wetlands, or did it anyway, and I'm a professional geoscientist with the state of Texas. And I do have degrees, two from Texas Tech and one from Texas A&M, all in soils. Now, I am definitely a child of Utah. I was born there, but then my dad went up to teach at what was Rick's College, and then left on this great zany adventure when I was 12 to Central America. So that's a whole story right there, but that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, springs right from there. Okay, so my title here is The City of God and Its Watershed. So obviously I'm trying to add a little something different to this idea. We've all heard the City of God, that I guess it was St. Augustine wrote that quite some time ago. But we know that there is this strong tradition within Mormonism for the city of God, for the place where the saints will come and dwell together. So I'm going to talk about that with a little bit of a spin here. If we can get this going in the right direction. Oh boy, there we go. Okay, so a lot of us are facing growth. I know that in Utah got growth coming and going. I think, Serena, you said you moved in from California. I think a lot of people moving that way. And in Texas, we have tremendous growth as well. So you'll see here I'm a little more focused on the prairies because that's where I've lived my life. Although I'm happy now in Guatemala with the big mountains again. But we're flatlanded out there, and we got a lot of people coming our way. So the question that we have to post here is, well, what's the best way to do this? Not only what would Jesus do, but what would Joseph do? Here he was talking about the city of God. How does it relate to what we're looking at here, and what might he recommend different for us? So we have two possibilities here. I'm obviously there's a continuum, but I'm going to just put it down to two, and we're going to take a little quiz here. So Serena, be at the ready here after I put up number two. So I want you to consider two alternatives here that are held by various people of goodwill, but quite a bit different. So one is this little house on the prairie. And this was not so little house on the prairie, but still, it's that little house on the prairie. This is as green as you could possibly want. All of that vegetation is native vegetation. The drive that comes up there is pervious pavement. It has solar. Well, you can't see it, but trust me. On the other side, there's some solar panels back there. It's all reused, repurposed lumber. They got composting toilets, which is really kind of the height of greenness, if you want to know the truth from a soil scientist here. So that's number one. And this house is on about 2 acres. So everything's wonderful. Everything's green. They got the credentials. They got the bona fides. Our other alternative is a little bit different. This alternative maybe we'll call it the concrete jungle. So this This one is in Houston, where I lived one time. And this is these are, for the sake of argument, they're non-native trees. There's no front yards. There's no backyards. It's just all paved over, the whole thing. In fact, if you looked at these buildings, they're holding about 30 to 40 units, 30 to 40 apartments in this area here. So this is cheek by jowl. Some people seem to like this. And there are actually some people who say, well, this is the way, this is what's most friendly towards the environment. All right, so Serena, if you are ready, we're going to take a poll here. We're going to take a vote, all right? And let's see. Okay, there you go. So look at that. Which one of these urban types is the best friend of the prairie? The little house on the prairie, that's number one, or two, the concrete jungle. So take just a second and click. Now, I'm not asking you which one you like or which one you want to live in. Not asking you that. I'm asking you what is the best for the environment. How can we build? All right, I'm not seeing where that's come up here, Serena. Does that?
3 out of 15, 20% said little house on the prairie, and 12 out of 15 said the concrete jungle, 80%.
Whoa, all right. We've got a knowable crowd here. When I do this in Texas, it's the reverse. People kind of know that, that's concrete jungle. We don't want that. So that's kind of amazing. All right. So yeah, that's, let's see, I've got the screen here. So that's right. This little house on the prairie looks very nice, but in reality, it's not doing so well, right? Here's some more of these big houses on the prairie. Well, you could say I've got 5 acres, I got 10 acres. Well, you are messing everything up by coming out here. You've raked it over. This is very nice. It's all green. They got all the vegetation. And most importantly, to a lot of these people, this is how they view it. Now, this is a real sign for a real subdivision that appeared in Houston not too many years ago. And also, I've heard the developers of the Woodlands, a very famous subdivision you may have heard of, that this is what they posited as a great benefit. Never see vehicles, and more importantly, never see neighbors. So we're going to come back to this because this is then central to Joseph's idea of what the city of God wasn't, right? And so we have a bit of a problem here. Now, I would, let's say maybe about 40 years, 45, well, maybe 30 years ago or so, I would have said, oh yeah, the green, that's, maybe not too many people can live quite that far apart, but I would have said, yeah, this is the better deal. But through time, and so again, this was my Guatemalan heritage, right? Running around the highlands, helping these campesino guys. But then through studying, and especially from my perspective, so I kind of view myself as the guardian of the wetlands, the guardian of the prairies there around Houston. I have a big shtick on this and how these areas are tremendous and biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. So it took me a little while to come around, and I think this is where a lot of our environmental friends still inhabit this kind of an area where, oh no, this is what we want. We want to spread out. We don't want to see our neighbors, et cetera. So here's then what I would pose to you, and I guess I was hoping for some shock value, but maybe this is no tremendous shock value to you. But what I would posit is these guys in Queens or wherever maybe they might be in Jackson Heights, I guess they're in the New York City area. These guys are by far greener than the little house on the prairie or those other houses, because they're using way less space, right? This is 6 stories. This is easily maybe 50 apartments to the acre, but it has the advantage of a certain amount of conviviality. Because you're going to see your neighbors. You can't say never see neighbors here. You're going to be running into your neighbors all the time. And this then is certainly part of the vision. Let's see, it wasn't supposed to do that. There we go. Well, let me throw a little science in here before we get into too much on the theological side, let's say. So the idea that pavement is injurious to watershed health has been known for quite some time. And we know that it doesn't take much. In fact, even you put your one house on an acre, those kind of subdivisions, we can measure the impact in something called the Index of Biological Integrity, the IBI. So this was kind of from a review paper. So we've got this IBI on the vertical axis, and then catchment imperviousness on the X or bottom axis here. And so what it's saying is, as we go up in imperviousness, this index goes down. So here you are. So a typical subdivision, I would imagine in Utah as well as Texas, is about 4 units to the acre. So you're down in here, and already even at 5%, we can see there's some measurable degradation. And so certainly started getting out into 30, 40% impervious surface across the whole watershed. We see some real damage. And then way out over here, of course, once you're 60, 70%, you're in maybe 3 to 4, even 5-story kind of areas. So pavement in itself is damaging. There's no question. I'm not trying to walk around that. There's no getting around it. So we did a little study with my crew, the Texas Coastal Watershed Program. So this was all model data. So we looked at runoff volume, and this is per dwelling unit per acre. This is how planners view density. So we're going here from 0. In fact, the numbers are up here, right? So 4 units to the acre. This 8 units, 16 units. So 16 were like, say, this could be townhomes, and then 64 units to the acre. This might be a good 4 to 5 stories, something like that. 256 people, not people, but units, right? So there's actually be 500 people per acre, right? So runoff goes as you would expect it. The more impervious surface you have, the higher the density, right? Then that runoff volume goes up, and it goes up spectacularly, but then it kind of tends to level off. Oh, I didn't put this on here, but if we looked at nitrogen or phosphorus, the typical kind of pollutants, they would have the same curve. The more the impervious surface, the higher the density, the more that runoff, the more damaging that runoff, the higher the runoff, which could have its own problems, and then all the nutrients in there as we get denser. But what we did then, we kind of turned that on its head, and we said, well, let's look at it another way. Let's think about it as acres per 100 units. So if we've got 100 units that we want to put somewhere, and how much does it take up, and what happens to the runoff there? So this is acres per 100 units. That means like an apartment, right? So here's at 4 units to the acre. This is if we're making a subdivision out there somewhere. We would need about 25 acres. And actually, you'd probably have to add in 20%, take out 20% for roads and streets, but we'll keep it simple here. So you've got 25 acres. 25 acres will hold 100 units at 4 units to the acre. As you increase the density, then you use less land. So up again, this is around 6. This is 16 units to the acre. Then we would need for 100 units, we would need 6.3 acres. Okay, so and that's a pretty big difference. And then we go over to Manhattan here, and we've got, I see, I can't quite, some of my stuff is, there we go. So the 100 units here in Manhattan style would easily fit within a half an acre. So that's quite a difference. You go from a half an acre to 25 acres. That's got to be some kind of a difference in the environmental impact. And indeed there is. So when we look at, let's see. Oh, so this is just the imperviousness coefficient. So we took this as literature. This is numbers from the literature. At 4 units to the acre, you are 30%. You've got 30% coverage already. And that's impervious surface. And that actually shows up very easily in watersheds. And then way down here at 256, it's 1. In other words, that 1 means the whole thing's paved over. All right, so don't want to get too technical here. We're just about through these graphs here. So runoff volume per 100 units. The other one we were looking at, right? We'll just kind of zoom back there right quick. Okay. Ooh, what is that doing there? This is runoff volume per, let's see. Yeah, per acre versus DUA, per acre. And then here so let's see. Okay, so now it's runoff volume per 100 units. So per 100 units, you turn this on its head, then here's the 4 units per acre way up here. And we got 4 and 8, 12. So down in here, we're getting close to the townhomes. Over here, we're kind of maybe like, let's say, the French Quarter there in Louisiana. But see how sharp that is going down. Okay. So what that means is, if you think of it then in terms of per unit, per capita even, rather than this per unit land, it turns things on its head. Okay. And this is the way we're going to be putting people out on the landscape. It's in terms of how many units per acre are you going to put down. Okay. So the less land you need, even though, and I could make the same curve here for the nutrients, okay? But especially at these higher levels, whatever damage is done by the impervious surface is totally and completely offset by the density, by the less land you're using. So if you're using 1 acre instead of 25 acres, even though your runoff might be a little higher in terms of the nutrients, right? It's still less damaging than these lower rates of runoff volume and lower rates of damaging nutrients at the lower density. So hopefully that makes sense. It's going to get a little maybe too technical here on that side, but density is its own reward. Okay, up in here, at the 4 units to the acre, well, that's not going to make such a difference. But once you get down in here, right? Can you see that little arrow when I'm pushing that around? I think you can, right? Okay. So down here, even though the runoff per acre is way more than it is up here, it's so much less land that the total load is much less, right? And so it's the load per acre. That's what we're interested in, right? It's the load per acre. All right. I'll save up all your questions. I know there must be some of you questioning what's going on here. You've probably seen something like this, with all the climate change kind of stuff, the data you can see. This is actually petroleum use. It could be vehicle miles traveled. It could be pervious surface. Here's where I spend part of my time, Houston, Texas. As you can see, it is a high consuming place because we build freeways and we got cars. And we don't want anybody telling us not to drive our cars. So we drive them all over the place. And then, even New York is still pretty high, but this is probably including, probably not just Manhattan. It's probably including a lot of the outer boroughs out there as well. But then you get to cities like Paris and London, very dense. So they themselves will have way less of a load per acre, per unit land than others. Yeah, are these uncomfortable places to live? I would venture not. People pay a lot of money to live in downtown Paris. They certainly pay a lot of money to live in these areas that are 250 acres, 250 units to the acre. People are buying these, and it's not cheap. When they talk about the prices of those units over there, they use single digits. This apartment is going to cost you 1.8, or this is 2.3. So they're not going because they can't stand it. They're going because they want all the stuff that comes with it. They're willing to give up on some of their space for all the stuff that waits for them out that front door. So let's come back then to this graphic here, right? This is our little house on the prairie, the concrete jungle. How does this then compare with what Brother Joseph was imagining as the city of Zion? And so many of you have probably seen this. The plat of Zion. This was Joseph's grand idea, and the idea here was density, way denser than anything that we see. Now, not as dense as the densest part of New York City, but this density here is about, I think I calculated it somewhere, it's about 15 units to the acre. So could be townhomes or townhomes that have just a little bit of space in between them. And then the very important parts that we all recognize, that planners recognize today, is this grid, right? A wonderful grid. I mean, the grid is without a doubt the best way to get around in a city, to keep traffic low, because you've got all these different ways of getting around. And then these lots are all about, in the literature I was reading 50 per 60, they look a little more oblong than that. But we're talking probably 3,000 foot lots. So these are pretty narrow lots that these folks lived on there. So Salt Lake didn't quite replicate this, right? You've got these humongous streets over there. I don't know quite remember how quite wide they are, but they're pretty wide, right? Brigham wanted to be able to turn a wagon train, not just a wagon, but I think a whole wagon train around. And so those streets were pretty big. But we still have the idea of a grid there, and certainly a certain amount of density in the center. And I believe that most of the cities, a lot of the smaller towns that were laid out in Utah with the immigration there, were based on this model. So Joseph was not thinking of water quality when he put this together, right? That certainly wasn't an issue for them. I wasn't thinking of prairies or swamps or anything of the sort. But what he was thinking about was conviviality. How well were people able to get together? So just backing up a little, this picture here is probably about 8 to 10 units to the acre. So you're about double the density of what you would have in a typical area. So you're still going to see, this is not going to be never see your neighbors, right? You're going to run into your neighbors all the time. So the city of Zion here is somewhere between this and then maybe something like this here. This is actually part of Houston, which is incredibly enough densifying as well. So these might be, again, these kind of they're still single family detached homes, but they're very close together. So you could stick out your hand to your neighbor and ask for a little bit of cream or whatever it is you need there, and you could reach out across. And fortunately, these houses nowadays have pretty good insulation, so you don't hear everything your neighbors are up to all the time. So these are patterns that we have certainly seen in a lot of our older cities around the country. But again, coming back to this idea of Joseph to build the city of Zion, it was not that we all be scattered out all over the place, but that they use this word, the gathering, to mean to really gather, not just to be spread out. Now, I want to recommend that you read a nice paper by Craig Galley, who's an attorney there in Utah, and he published, I'm pretty sure it was in the BYU Studies, on the plat of the city of Zion, and he's got all these great quotes from the leaders of the church on this kind of stuff. So I highly recommend that to you. So this is actually from Austin, Texas, and this was their old airport. And to me, so what was Brother Joseph thinking about here? Well, he was thinking about friendship. So this is a quote from a church manual back, when they had it for each of the prophets. So according to them, they said friendship is one of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism. They had Joseph saying this. It unites the human family with its happy influence. And I think I've read other places where they cite this, but where Joseph actually says friendship is the grand fundamental. So, but he had the two grand fundamentals were friendship, and then the other one was we are accepting of all truths, come where they may. So Joseph, this is what drove then this idea of the city of God, is not that we're spread out all over the place, but that we have this conviviality where we're close to others. So in a subdivision like this, there's no never see your neighbors here. You're going to see your neighbors quite a bit all the time. And so, you're stepping out, there's a little parking lot back there, you're coming and going, you're going to be seeing them. And hopefully in a place like this, you'd have a few corner stores at different intersections. You're just out and about, you're seeing each other. Where I lived in Clear Lake before I came to Guatemala, you just wouldn't see your neighbors, and we're so hot there. You just kind of stay inside, you drive your car in, you go into the garage, you get out, you get into that cool air as soon as possible. You don't walk anywhere. In fact, if you see someone walking in certain neighborhoods, you have two things to be thinking about here. Number one is, well, do you need some help? Why are you walking out here? And the other is, well, maybe I better call the police. What's this person doing here? It's just that unusual for people to be out and about walking. So again, refocusing then on this, friendship is the grand fundamental here of what drives the city of God, is to be together, not to be spread out, but to be in each other's life, to have these networks of assistance, of compassion. So the word that I like to use here then in describing Brother Joseph's ideas about the city is the number one thing that we're interested in is conviviality. Conviviality with each other. We always see in our neighbors. We have these networks going back and forth. So the city of God then. Here's Joseph Smith. Let everyone live in the city, for this is the city of Zion. And that's how Utah was laid out, right? It wasn't, say, compared to other places in the country. These small towns, if you're a farmer, you lived in the town, and then you rode out however you could get out to your farmland, wherever it is. Say versus a lot of, and that was certainly the pattern in New England, where a lot of these folks came from. But if you go to other parts of the country, sort of like Texas or other places, just about anywhere, farmers tend to live out and would come into the city center to do their business, but they weren't living in the city center. They'd live out, isolated from one another. No, not totally isolated. People obviously would come together for country dances and things like that. But Joseph is saying, live in the city. This is the city of Zion. Well, we're a long way from the city of Zion, but building something that looks like that is going to help get us there. So this is, here's George Q. Cannon in April 1889. This is cited in Craig Galley's work again. We have been called to gather, not to scatter. We have been called by the Lord to build up Zion, to beautify the waste places, not to spread out all over creation and become so thin and so weak that there is no strength or power within us. Goodness gracious. This sounds like some kind of a radical person here. And well, that's what they were. They were going for the root, right? So not spread out all over creation. Let's stay together because we strengthen each other. So to me, that's pretty radical, pretty profound. So what could a city of God look like today? Let's see, I'm just going to kind of move. There we go. This was a work that we did, my crew and some others, with the Congress for New Urbanism. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with the Congress of New Urbanism, but that's where a lot of these sort of new practitioners on walkability and convenience and walking and getting around. So we brought in a couple to work with us, and we actually went. This was a competition to design the greenest place. And so they actually, this is a 1 acre of land, right? I mean, when it's 1 square mile, 640 acres. And they said, we want this to be, at suburban densities. We're not going to densify. 4 units to the acre, and then you tell us, what kind of best management practices, or BMPs is how we say that in the trade. So our crew said, well, we don't want to do that. We're going to break the mold here, and we're just going to use a quarter of that land, right? So we're going to go for 16 units to the acre instead of 4, but we'll still get the same lot yield. We'll still be able to sell the same number of houses. But here, then, things are quite a bit more connected. There's a range of densities here. It's not all just super hyper density. I'll show you a little bit of a different aerial here in a minute. But just imagine, so here's this 640 acres, and if we can manage to preserve the rest of this down here, 640 minus a quarter, I don't have on the tip of my tongue, think of your kids. Your kids could be out working on the farm out here, right? Wouldn't be a hard thing to be doing. This could be a mix of native pastures. It could be in native prairies. It could be farmland. This is actually Houston's best farmland out to the west of town. And then if we look at it from a different perspective, we actually had quite a bit of drawings on this, but I've just taken one or two. So here you can see that the kind of a gradient, right, from the central part. Here's these 2, 3, 4-story areas, probably, well, not probably, we would definitely have commerce on the bottom floor. So they'd be kind of live-work areas, a little bit bigger houses out in here, and eventually bleeding out into townhomes and things like that. There's a big wetland over here. I work with wetlands a lot, constructed wetlands for stormwater, so we designed that into our little model here. Pretty good sized wetland where all of this runoff would move down in that direction. So it's not like we're not antagonistic toward this idea of the best management practices towards helping rainfall to stay where it falls. In fact, here you can see a nice central rainway along one of these streets here. So we're trying to get water into the soil and out into this wetland. But because we're higher density, we could not get the same retention, say, as those people in this competition, where they're just filling out the whole thing at 4 units to the acre. So we may have a little more, again, as I said before, a little bit more of polluted runoff per acre, but per capita, it is way less. And so the Katy Prairie, in fact, is an imperiled prairie in Houston. It's the one that's most well known. It's to the west of town. And we got those big floods, we actually name our floods, the Memorial Day flood, Tax Day flood, and then of course there was Harvey, which blew out all the fuses on there. So the idea then is to still, do what we can to mitigate those kind of things, but recognizing that it's building flood-proof kind of things out here is what's going to help us. And the more we can densify, then the more we leave of that prairie where the water can get in. And the actual big bunch grasses of the prairies will hold water themselves. So if we do this kind of a pathway, it gives us a lot more opportunities. But nobody is building that way right now, I'm sorry to tell you. So the problem here is we have a disjuncture here between site and structure and watershed and community. So a lot of the stormwater community, a lot of the folks like I used to be myself, and I still consider myself a green person, if we tend to focus on the site, what's coming off the site and the structure, then we'll build stuff like this, and we'll posit that as the greenest possibility. Whereas we think in terms of a watershed, we take a whole different perspective here. And we can think in terms of community as well. So we think in terms of a watershed, and we think in terms of a community. So this is, I think, the Pearl District over in Boulder, Colorado. Wonderful pedestrian-oriented kind of a thing, but it kind of springs out of this idea of a broader picture, right? Higher density, this is highly paved over, but its impact is so much less. But the livability is so much more. Now, one thing I don't set this up, but you just think in your mind, a lot of the lectures I would give, I'd ask people, how many of you would live in a neighborhood like this? And had raise of hands, maybe got 30 people, maybe 5 people say, oh yeah, I'd like to live in there. And then I say, well, what if I had just a block away, what if I had something like this? Bookstores, coffee shops, etc., the cleaners. What if you had this? And the only way for you to have this, all this stuff here close together, the only way that's going to happen is that then you would have to live in something like this. Now, how many of you would want to do that? Well, then way more hands. Never 100%, right? There's always holdouts, but it might go up quite a bit, maybe double, maybe get to 20 out of 30 or something like that. So again, this is this higher density. It's not super high density. It's not Manhattan density, right? It's not even French Quarter density, but it's at least double or triple the density of our typical neighborhood. So when you develop at 4 units to the acre, you can't support bus service. You can't support transit, unless you're going to highly subsidize it, but it would require quite some subsidy to do that. So it's just a question of, what is it that you want? And it's a little easier to engineer some affordable housing into these kind of areas where you've got higher density through some set-asides or whatever there. All right, so just to kind of summarize a little bit, we're almost down to the end here. So the city of God is what? Well, number one, it's dense and it's compact. Things are close together, right? They're not separated. This is I would say this is how I kind of view heaven. I don't know about most of y'all. Of course, none of us have been there, but I would imagine it being a lot of people moving around, kind of talking to each other, having a good time, right? That conviviality, not just, in my house there are many mansions. Well, it doesn't mean the mansions are like those big green monstrosities connected to no one. It means you're living close together. So the city of God, number one, is dense and compact because it's walkable. You can get around. There's a lot more stuff that you can get to as you walk, through these kind of areas. And it's convivial. It's convivial in and of itself with the people in there, and it's convivial with the watershed that feeds into it or that it feeds into. There's a full conviviality, a full intimacy with your watershed where you live. And I must say that certainly Utah has done some great things in terms of preserving some of those hinterlands. I think you call it the Canyonlands Project, if I'm not mistaken, trying to keep that watershed imperviousness as low as possible, because that's where your water is coming from. Okay, so but again, these BMPs aren't necessarily the best way to go. They can certainly help, but you don't get the great reduction that you get when you put a lot of people closer together. So and one paradigm that I like to use as I'm thinking about watershed is this paradigm of health. So just like we have health and we have problems too, so too with the watershed. And so we can think of Dr. Watershed here. I'm a watershed doctor, by the way. We can start with this little central city, and then we grow up and we get more and more, and maybe this is this less dense stuff out here, but we're still occupying all the watershed. So what we want to do, we'd like to keep as much of that free as we can. So you might imagine this being your Canyonlands, or we would imagine it being our Katy Prairie. We want to keep, because the Katy Prairie feeds into where the biggest floods are in Houston. So we want that water to stay out there, because just putting in some rain gardens and pervious pavement, it's not going to do it. Doesn't cut it for the city of God here. So, Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold. One of my favorite statements, hopefully one of yours as well: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. Okay? That's, there's a prophet if there ever one was, and I'm not saying these prophets here ever, but certainly a prophet looking ahead. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty. So that idea has stood the test. He died, I think, about 1949. But I would take that and say, even of a place like this, we can still say a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the human community, because we're part of the abiotic community. So beauty is the sure guide. So here's a Brigham Young who's just full of these great quotes. We enjoy because we have sensibility, promote this sensibility, and seek to get more and more knowledge, more wisdom, and more understanding. This will give us a greater sensibility. So we read, we study. What is it that makes communities vibrant and strong? Well, it has to do with how often you see your neighbors, how often you get together. Where are your public spaces where you can engage with folks in discussions, etc. Beauty is the sure guide. Whether it's a prairie, whether it's a forest, or whether it's a city. And that beauty, the beauty at the city level, comes from, I think, from public spaces, from places that you enjoy being, that you want to be. Now, Serena, you tell me when I'm about to zap. Now, I've just got a couple of little examples here. This is the Woodlands in Texas. Maybe some of you have heard about this place. This is the very best sprawl that money can buy. There's no better sprawl than this. It's the number one. So you go here, and then here's this typical street. Doesn't look like there's anything there, but behind all that stuff, we could have been looking down that street. Behind all that, you just got this little strip of trees. And then all of a sudden, here's all the big box stuff that we all love so much, right? Maybe there's a Target or a Walmart or who knows what there. Well, this is a disaster, so the problem here is then people see this and they say, oh, well, yeah, isn't that great? It must have some ecological significance. Well, obviously it has zero, maybe not zero, but pretty close to it, right? It's just this little narrow strip. Now think about this. Would you want your 13-year-old daughter walking out here in the late evening or even when it's the nighttime? No, I don't think you would. I certainly wouldn't, okay? And there's not even any sidewalks there. And in fact, I was at a conference where the folks from the Woodlands were being lauded. And one of the main developers said, yeah, because you can drive all over the place and never see a house and never see a neighbor. Well, this is not even in the church sense. Let's just go back to civic spaces and democracy. This is not a builder of democracy. This is a builder of isolation, this kind of a thing. Well, I'm happy to say that the Woodlands has seen the light. I didn't bring that slide along, but they've actually built, I'd say, one of the better city centers. They call it Market Square. It's the old downtown, with a square and walkable stuff and all that kind of stuff. And then they've actually built some nice little townhomes around it too. So even in Texas, we're kind of coming around to some of this stuff. What's the sweet spot for density? When I first kind of started coming over this way, looking at this urban literature, I would have said, well, hey, pack them in. I don't care how but just pack them in because I don't want them to be in my wetlands. I don't want them to be in the prairie. Well, that's not very productive, is it? But 256 acres, if you looked at those graphs that I showed you, you're actually getting a pretty marginal return once you get out past, say, 40 units to the acre, 30, 40 units to the acre. So something like this is in Boston. Here, this is probably a little higher than 40 units to the acre. There's Fenway Park for you there. But the very cool thing is here, this is one of the biggest allotment gardens I've ever seen. So these guys are living pretty tight in here, but they've got these tremendous gardens that they can come out to. And so I'm a gardener myself, and I went down walking through there. There's nothing like two gardeners coming together. These folks explained to me what they're growing, told them what I was growing, a lot of conviviality there. So there's ways that we can build density. It's not like we have to wear the environmental hair shirt, right? We do what's best for us, we do what Brother Joseph would have done, right? Because he certainly would have evolved. That would not have been exactly the same thing. I think the fundamentals would be there, the grid, the short blocks, those kind of things would still be there, right? But it would have evolved. So we have examples like this around the world that you can look at. Now, this is, okay, I'm running out of time. This is the last test, and we can't do a quiz on this. Okay, there's a best management project, a best management mechanism here that is the finest practice for water, right? Can anyone point that out to me? This is downtown Houston. There's a best management practice here that's just popping out. Anybody take a quick guess? No, they don't want to take a quick guess. All right, here it is. It's this guy right here, the light rail. Why the light rail? Because it enables high density. When you got a light rail that you depend on, just like you have your tracks up there, you can depend on that. You don't have to have a car. You can live without a car and therefore live in significantly denser places. And what I always like to point out is, okay, the light rail is the duck's friend, right? Because we're not eating up that Katy Prairie and the other prairies we have. So the duck's best friend is this light rail. And I think I'm going to, one last slide. This says, what does this say? I get this zapped here. Love your stream, right? And down here is a little thing that says, leave wildlife alone. Leave them alone. What are they not getting? So look at that. That's the Wasatch Mountains out there. I don't know if it's the Wasatch. I think I bought this from some guy in Colorado. Maybe he's on the other side. All right. So this is the dream that so many of us have, the dream that I had. But I woke up. I know other people who have woken up. I won't harass them here, though. So I'm going to leave it at that. I do have a firm testimony of Brother Joseph and his inimitable vision for the city of God. So I'll leave that with you, and I guess we have time for a few questions.